We begin with a word from our host. Jillian Lester has been, since 2015, the Dean of the Law School. She's also the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Law and an expert on employment law. Dean Lester.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to bring all of us together, and just so honored that Columbia Law School has the privilege of hosting this exhibit that is the subject of tonight's commentary and dawns our walls outside this room. Before I comment on the exhibit itself, I have the very pleasurable duty of offering thanks to a number of people. And the list this is a reflection of just how many hands have gone into bringing us to this day. The list is fairly long, and so I'll ask that you hold applause until after I set the moment by applauding myself, but it's. I'm sure I will mention many who deserve acknowledgement, and I will forget to mention or overlook to mention others who deserve acknowledgement. And so forgive me for that. Thank you to Patrick Chappatte and Anne-Frédérique Widmann, who created this exhibit and who have worked closely with the team at Columbia. Thank you, Anne Romadka, who curated the original exhibit and its installation here at Columbia Law School. Thank you to the members of the Columbia Law School team who worked tirelessly, really, and for many months to bring this exhibit in-house. Professor Jeff Fagan, Ellen Chapnick, our SJI Dean Emerita, Brendan Malley, way back there, Brian Jurgens, I saw you earlier, thank you. Elise Clayman and the law school communication staff, all who came together to make this happen. I'd like to acknowledge the Switzerland Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and Swiss Secretary of State Pascal Beresfield for generously supporting the national tour of Windows on Death Row and also for agreeing to include Columbia Law School in its journey. We're grateful to the government of Switzerland more generally and its relationship with the United Nations Human Rights Division for shedding light on capital punishment issues and bringing this conversation to the fore here in both the United States and beyond, worldwide. We also have in attendance tonight, and I'd like to acknowledge, Ambassador André Schaller, Consul General of Switzerland in New York, Ambassador Nicole Virsch, and Deputy Consul General Giorgio Pompilio. I'd also like to acknowledge our special guest for this evening, our host, Bill Keller, previously the executive editor of the New York Times from July 2003 to September 2011. Bill's now the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, one of the most respected and important sources of information regarding criminal justice matters. And last but not least, let me thank and acknowledge the presence of Ndume Olatushani, a very talented artist whose work is featured in the exhibit. So now, I invite you all to join me in When the Windows on Death Row installation first appeared in our halls, I had the very special experience of viewing it during a quiet moment before the hustle and the bustle of the return of classes and the return of all of the students into the building. What I saw, and what you'll see tonight, is artwork prepared by death row inmates, as well as professional illustrators, deftly curated, intelligently curated, in a way that connects art, observation, and activism. Its aim to encourage discussion and debate about the future of capital punishment in the United States. When I viewed the exhibit in these quiet halls, I was fascinated by what I saw, but I was also profoundly moved Yes, it was fascinating art. Some beautiful, some uncomfortable, some visceral. And yes, it's a hard-hitting piece of political and social commentary. It demands conversation. But what moved me was none of these things. What moved me was its humanity, the immediacy, even intimacy, of viewing the work of a person on death row who's battling with his or her own demons, thoughts, emotions. This is a very different vantage point into death row than the way we so often experience it in public life as consumers of news, political commentary, law school classes. Discussions tend to focus on the crime, on the victims, the method of execution, the policies of the government. Matters that can render strong emotions, to be sure. I don't intend to suggest that normally we view these matters dispassionately. No, we view them passionately. We might talk about the motive of the inmate and whether the inmate feels remorse. These are passionate subjects. How we should handle these matters. These are passionate subjects. But this exhibit allows us to glimpse something else, something very different and something deeply personal. While some inmates have been exonerated, many did the things they were accused of doing. This exhibit is not about relitigating guilt or innocence. Instead, what it does is it reveals how inmates, through their art, find an outlet through which they can express their inner thoughts and emotions, their very human experiences in relation to family, to loved ones, to their faith, and to their own feelings about who they are. It's by presenting death row through this lens that Windows on Death Row hopes to spark a different kind of conversation than we're usually able to have about capital punishment. And it's a very special experience for us here tonight to be able to open this exhibit and begin this conversation. To talk more about the importance of the work that you will see here tonight, I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. From the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State, Ms. Pascale Beresfil. Ms. Beresfil was appointed to the role of Secretary of State in December 2016. The first woman to hold such a position, Ms. Beresfil and the department are charged with coordinating Swiss foreign policy on behalf of the Federal Council and safeguarding the interests of Switzerland with respect to human rights, democracy, and the peaceful coexistence of its peoples. Ms. Beresfil.
Thank you, Dean Lester, for your great speech and for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be here tonight and to be present at this opening of the Windows on Death Row. After having toured the United States and Europe for almost 2 years, the art exhibit is now coming to New York, and I'm sure Windows on Death Row will not only touch your eyes, but also your heart and your mind. I was also deeply moved when I looked at the exhibit just before. I did not have a quiet moment with these intimate paintings. It was much more the hustle and the quassle, and even the hustle and the quassle in the margins of the United Nations opening of the high level of the General Assembly. But I was deeply impressed and moved by the intensity of those paintings and drawings. It's as if those colors would like to resist or even fight death. And I was particularly moved by the painting of Arnold Prieto, who was then executed in July 2015. Anne-Frédérique Widmann and Patrick Chappatte, the exhibit's co-creators, believe in the power of images. This may not be surprising, given that Anne-Frédérique is a filmmaker and Patrick is a political cartoonist. As a diplomat, I live in a completely different world. A world where words are often considered more important than images. And I'm very happy that tonight allows us to join these two worlds, the world of words and the world of images. Switzerland opposes fundamentally the death penalty everywhere and under all circumstances. Working towards the abolition of the death sentence worldwide is a foreign policy priority of my country. Why? Firstly, death penalty, in our view, is not compatible with human rights and human dignity. It violates the right to life, as well as the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishments. Secondly, the death penalty does not deter criminals, and even less so terrorists. Thirdly, the death penalty does not bring peace and security. It is a violent act itself, and as such only perpetuates violence. And there is another point we shouldn't forget. We are all human, and humans make mistakes. Our judicial systems are made by humans, and thus, even in the strongest judicial systems, errors happen. Most mistakes can be corrected. Executing an innocent person is a mistake that can never be corrected. And I'm very glad that Ndume, thanks to his resistance and the commitment of his lawyer, can be with us tonight and still be alive and share his experience with us. And finally, there are issues pertaining to inequality and discrimination. Let there be no misunderstanding. This is not a discussion about guilt and innocence. But as this exhibition shows, ethnic or racial minorities, poor people, and people on the margins of society are more likely to be affected by the death penalty than others. And while discrimination and inequality are not peculiar to the death penalty, they are fatal when it comes to this form of punishment. Some people may object that we should care about the human rights of criminals, especially of those who have committed terrible crimes, that we should not care about those. Let me quote Nelson Mandela. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Criminals are human beings, and as human beings they have human rights. It was Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher and lawyer of the times of the Enlightenment, who already in the 18th century was convinced that torture and capital punishment are instruments which a society and state should not refer to. Punishment should not be an instrument of revenge, but of prevention. In his work, Dei delitti e delle pene, about crimes and punishment, he explains that it is not the severeness of a punishment, but an effective system of punishment which deters crime. I have no doubts. If we want to protect our human rights, we have to protect the human rights of others. This is why my country defends and promotes the universality of human rights. And this is why we are committed to the worldwide abolition of the death penalty. We use a variety of instruments and fora to convince others that the death penalty is wrong, useless and dangerous, and that it incites further pain and hatred. For instance, we promote the abolition of death penalty when we talk to other governments bilaterally. And we put the issue on the agenda of international bodies such as the UN General Assembly here in New York or the Human Rights Council in Geneva. In fact, Swiss diplomats in Geneva are currently negotiating a resolution which we initiated together with a number of partner governments on the human rights implications of the death penalty. And I think such a dialogue as you can have with those paintings in this exhibition is also an instrument which is dear to us to somehow take this discussion and conversation a step further. But as diplomats, words are our main tool. Words are powerful, but sometimes they are limited. This is why we have built a partnership with people who work with images. Combining words with images, our message has become stronger and it lasts longer. Words fade, images stay. I would like to thank Patrick Chappatte and Anne-Frédérique Widmann for this impressive project. And I would also like to thank the Columbia Law School and Dean Gillian Lester, and also our host, for hosting this exhibit and hosting us here tonight. And let us all recognize and honor the artists, both inside and outside of prison walls, for their thought-provoking visual contributions to the debate about the death penalty. I thank you all for coming here tonight. Please spread the word. And if you believe your word is not strong enough, then make people see. I thank you.
I've been given a few minutes to set the stage for what comes later. Essentially, this evening and this exhibit bring together two subjects that figure often in our reporting at the Marshall Project. One subject of the evening and of the art on display is capital punishment. The other is the role of culture in our criminal justice system, as a window into the system, as an outlet for the men and women who are trapped in it, and as a vehicle for rehabilitation. The Marshall Project, I should say, is not an advocacy organization and does not take a position on capital punishment. Our job is to pay attention, to ask questions, to illuminate, and let our readers draw their own conclusions. But even if you believe that the death penalty is morally justified, it's hard to deny that the legal machinery for carrying it out is severely flawed. The first story we did when we launched our website in November 2014 examined the cases of prisoners who missed a deadline for filing a final habeas appeal, a deadline written into law as a tough-on-crime provision of the Republican contract with America, an attempt to speed up executions. Hashtag Newt Gingrich. Our reporter found 80 cases of inmates sent to death row without a final appeal because their lawyers blew the deadline, in one case by a single day. By the time of our story, 16 of them had already been put to death. A few months later, we examined the case of Todd Willingham, who was executed in Texas in 2004 for setting a fire that killed his 3 young daughters. The conviction had already been called into question because of outdated fire forensics. We were the first to report another serious flaw in the case. A jailhouse informant who claimed he heard Willingham confess admitted to us that he made up the story to earn a shortening of his own sentence. We and others have reported extensively on the arbitrary nature of capital punishment. Whether or not you get the death penalty can depend on the color of your skin, the size of your bank account, even your zip code. There are more than 3,000 counties in the U.S. Last year, all of the new death sentences handed down occurred in 27 of those counties. We have a feature on our website called Next to Die, which tracks pending executions. The point being that whether you're an abolitionist, an enthusiast, or ambivalent, you should face the reality of capital punishment because it's the greatest power we give to the state. The unspoken point of Next to Die is not that these condemned people are innocent. Most of the people on death row committed terrible crimes. They're not innocent, but they're human. And that's very much the spirit of this evening. In recent years, the death penalty has been in decline somewhat. I don't know whether that will continue, but it has been the trend, even though a majority of the public say they favor it for some crimes. There are several possible reasons for this. One is the decline in crime generally since the 90s. Another is probably the fact that life without parole has become more widely available as an option. When polls offer a choice between death and life without parole, people are pretty much evenly split. I like to think some people have been swayed by the number of people who've been exonerated while awaiting their lethal injection. Justice Scalia famously said that there has not been one conclusive case of an innocent person being executed. That's debatable, but there have been undeniably quite a few close calls. Another possible reason for the decline in the standing of the death penalty is the spectacle of botched executions and the increasing difficulty of getting the lethal drugs. But probably the main factor in the declining number of executions is time. Because the appeals drag on for years, the costs of legal time, expert witnesses, mitigation specialists, mental health evaluations, not to mention the heightened security on death row, are enormous, and the ordeal of the families of victims is prolonged. Some prosecutors have decided that pursuing a capital case is just too much of a strain on their budgets. Because of the time factor, many death sentences are reversed before they're carried out, because the courts find death row prisoners have mental conditions that make them ineligible for the death penalty, or they had incompetent representation, or that there was misconduct by the prosecutors. Thus, one of the peculiarities of this subject is that most people sentenced to death are never executed. Brandon Garrett, a professor at University of Virginia Law School, has a new book out on the death penalty, and one statistic caught my eye. From 1991 to 2015, 4,800 death sentences were handed down. The number of executions that took place during that time frame was 600. If you're on death row, you're almost as likely to die of old age as to be executed. This year, we've seen a number of prosecutors elected on reform platforms, including opposition to capital punishment. I don't know whether that will have a measurable impact on the machinery of capital punishment, but it's at least a small shift in the politics of criminal justice. Later this evening, we'll talk with two lawyers who've devoted themselves to the issue of capital punishment. The second subject this evening is the value and the lack of cultural programming for the incarcerated. One area where inmates, correctional officers, and wardens generally agree is that educational, cultural, and other programs behind bars are a healthy outlet for inmates, greatly improve the chances that a released inmate will not return, and have a civilizing effect on institutions that can be very frightening. But contrary to our supposed American faith in second chances, we don't invest very heavily in programs aimed at occupying and improving the minds of incarcerated people. Last week, the Marshall Project told the story of Michelle Jones, who served more than 20 years for murder and used the time to become a respected scholar of American history. She was admitted upon her release, before her release, she was admitted to some of the top history PhD programs in the country, including her first choice, Harvard, but the administration retracted Harvard's invitation. NYU was delighted to have her. Our story was on the front page of the New York Times, and the comments on social media underscored a deep divide in our country between those who believe in redemption and those who find at least some crimes unforgivable. To take you deeper into the issues of culture and incarceration, I'm going to yield the stage to Patrick and Anne-Frédérique. They are the husband and wife team that founded Windows on Death Row, the project you're about to see. It opened in Los Angeles in October 2015 and has been touring the U.S. since. Patrick is an editorial cartoonist for the New York Times. Formerly, he has been with the International Herald Tribune. He's won several awards for his work. Anne-Frédérique is a Swiss investigative reporter and documentary filmmaker. And I'm happy to hand off the microphone to them.
You know, an image, a cartoon, a piece of art is something you look at, and sometimes it's the other way around. It's the image that seems to be looking at you. Let us tell you the story behind this image. On January 21st, 2015, I had to make the hardest phone call of my life. It was 3:30 Texas time, and I dialed the number of the Huntsville prison, and I asked to speak to Arnold Prieto.
This man is Arnold Prieto. In '93, when he was 20 years old, he was convicted for murder of an elderly couple during a robbery. Prieto refused to testify against his two accomplices in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was the only one sentenced to death. When he sent us this drawing at the end of 2014, Prieto had already received his execution date. He knew the 21st of January 2015 would be the last day of his life. When that day came, he had the right to make a few last phone calls. That's when he asked to speak to us.
So I called Prieto, and he wanted to talk about art, about drawing techniques. He told me I learned how to paint in prison. My drawings will still be there when I'm no more. This was Prieto's last drawing. Our conversation lasted only a few minutes, often interrupted by the guards. Then he said, I have to go now. Before hanging up, he said, have a nice day. 3 hours later, Arnold Prieto gave his last statement. He said, there are no endings, only beginnings. And as the injection began, he said, wow, I can smell it. At 6:31 p.m. Texas time, Arnold Prieto was pronounced dead.
This woman witnessed Arnold Prieto's execution. Her name is Dina Milito. She became a strong opponent of the death penalty after being herself the victim of a violent crime. At the age of 20, she was left dead, almost dead, in her backyard. She has been to hell and back, but today she has one belief. She says, I know that the execution of a human being doesn't contribute to peace of mind and justice.
You know, they stick a needle in your arm at the end, and the actual death part of it takes 2 or 3 minutes. But the execution starts the day the warrant's signed. So my feeling was that that's the worst part. I mean, the waiting and the hoping and the saying goodbye to everybody that's the hardest part, you know? I mean, I feel like it's torture. I feel like if people knew what people went through, it's torture. It's horrible. The last visits, a mother saying goodbye to her child, the sounds of his mother crying after their last phone call at the hospitality house are sounds I never want to hear again. I never want to hear a mother crying like that again. If anybody heard that, I just don't see how you could say that that was justice, especially if there's a shadow of a doubt, you know.
Windows on Death Row is an exhibition that brings together art from inside and outside the prison walls, because images often speak louder than words. On one side, we have asked some of the best American political cartoonists to send us their take on capital punishment.
This is from Clay Bennett of the Chattanooga Free Press in Tennessee. This is Joel Pett at the Lexington Herald Leader in Kentucky.
As for the views from inside the prison, we reached out to death row inmates. We asked them to be witness and to draw their daily lives. Armando Macias from San Quentin Prison in California gave us this: a hard bunk, a metal sink and toilet, and a small table in a tiny cell. To put this project together, we visited maximum security prisons around the United States and made direct contact with 30 inmates who accepted to be part of this.
And so tonight we are taking you with us on this journey with art from the exhibition, with videos we made and part of a graphic novel series we did for the New York Times. We invite you to open a window on death row.
In the summer of 2014, when we started working on this project, the death penalty was in the spotlight again. Europe had banned companies from exporting lethal drugs to the US. The lethal drugs on which prison relied on were not available anymore. States started experimenting with new death cocktails.
Several executions went wrong that year. Inmates agonized on the gurney for 30, 40 minutes before dying.
In December 2014, with the help of 2 art teachers, we were able to organize a drawing workshop on death row. In Nashville, 10 inmates were willing to take part in our projects. We were going to meet 10 guys who had been sentenced to death. So we took this road, the road leading to Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, a prison Ndume knows very well. When they first arrive here, inmates are placed in Unit 2, Level C, strict solitary confinement for 18 months, shackled most of the time. If they behave well, they're transferred to Level B, slightly less strict. It's only after years that those who behave well are upgraded to Level A, where they have writing and drawing workshops. Those are the guys we're going to meet.
We pass security. We walk through razor wire fences, double gates through which we have to be buzzed. And we enter a room where 10 men in white prison jumpsuits are waiting for us.
This man walks straight up to me, Gary Cohn, 67 years old, 33 years spent on death row, and he tells me right away, I'm guilty. I killed a man. I came back from Vietnam a drug addict, and I knew how to use guns. This is one of his drawings. It's called How to Lose a Year in 4 Easy Steps. It's a true story. It actually happened to Cohn. In the first panel, a guard finds some rotten apple juice in his cell. Cohn is accused of brewing juleps, a homemade prison whiskey. He's sent to the disciplinary board. They sentence him to 1 year back to Unit B, strict solitary confinement for a whole year. Last year, after more than 30 years on the road, Gary Cohn died in prison. This artwork is by Harold Wayne Nichols on Tennessee death row. He wrote, "It's been 26 years since I've seen the stars in the sky." Harold also gave us a letter with this painting, a letter addressed to you. He writes, "Prison has taught me the importance of the little things in life. When was the last time you drove out beyond the lights of the city just to see the stars? I hope you will take time to do that and to enjoy the little things life has to offer."
And then there's Abu, the wise man of the group, an old man now. This is what he chose to draw. It's about life making its way into his cell. In this completely sealed off maximum security prison, an ant, a bee, and a mouse come to visit him from time to time.
Most of these inmates have committed terrible crimes, but our project is not about crime. It's about what comes after, about our collective response to crime, about the shortcomings of the justice system, about the effects of solitary confinement. Many of the guys who participate in our project have spent more than 20 years in their cell. And one of the toughest places to spend that time is Texas.
This is the Polanski unit in Livingston, Texas. You can tell which block houses the death row inmates. So on the left, you have the regular cells, double row of windows. And then you have the death row cells, only a tiny opening, 6 feet above ground. That's where we meet Abel Ochoa, 45 years old. He's been locked up for the past 15 years in solitary confinement. Now, let us explain what solitary confinement means in a place like Texas. Inmates are locked up 23 hours a day in a cell like this, waiting for the day of their execution. The rule from day one in that prison is no physical contact. The only contact is when the guards handcuff them. Twice a week, they have 2 hours outside, 2 people at a time, each in his own cage. We came up with a basketball game. The first who makes 10 baskets win. In this prison, breakfast is served at 2:30 a.m., lunch at 10 a.m., dinner at 3:30 in the afternoon.
We were allowed to interview Abel Ochoa. Listen to what he had to say.
This environment, it's made to break you down as a person. Emotionally and mentally, it's designed to break you down. We don't have contact visits, as you see. We don't have church services. We don't have group recreation. We don't have a work program. We don't have no TVs. So it's designed to break you down. Now, at the same time, knowing that, it's up to you as an individual not to let them break you down. It's up to you to find something positive to do with your time that you have, which, like I share with people, we have more time than you all do have out in the world. We have more time to read books, we can get educated here. We can get our GED, we can do Bible studies here. Some people write books, some people, do artwork, and just that you have to find something positive with your time. And that's something that advice was given to me when I got here, and guys knew that this was my first time being locked up. They said, you better find something positive to do with your time, if not you're going to lose your mind. And that's true. If you don't, practice, keep your mind working, something positive, something creative, you can lose your sanity.
So every day, Abel does the same things. He reads his Bible, prays, listens to preachers on the radio.
On Sunday, August 4th, 2002, Ochoa murdered 5 family members, including his women and children. Abel was a drug addict. Crack turned him into a killer. When we asked him if he had a message to pass on to you, he said, "Do you know anybody on drugs? Tell them to get away from it. It will mess up their mind."
On the day of his execution, he'll have his last visits. Remember, no physical contact whatsoever, so it's going to happen only through these glass windows. Then he will be taken in a white minivan along the road that leads to Huntsville, Texas, a 50-minute drive through green landscapes. Huntsville is the national capital of death penalty. Since 1976, Texas has executed 543 people, 5 times more than the top second and third states, Virginia and Oklahoma.
This is the Waltz unit in Huntsville. The execution chamber is there on the left at the end of this wing. One day of May 2015, we're standing right there. It's raining. At 6 p.m., a man will be executed. His name is Derek Charles. He's what they call a low-profile inmate. African-American, clear-cut murder case, no support network. Just a few of us are standing here, staring at the clock. At 6:50 p.m., the door opens and the prison spokesperson comes out.
My name is Jason Clark, Jason, J-A-S-O-N, Clark, C-L-A-R-K. Derek Charles was executed tonight. He did make a brief last statement. When asked by the warden if he'd like to make a last statement, he said, "I'm ready to go home." It was at that point that the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered, and he lost consciousness immediately. Charles was pronounced deceased 25 minutes after the lethal dose began. He did not make eye contact with the victims. He stared straight ahead. Have any questions?
Do you have any family members there?
Charles had no witnesses present. There were witnesses of the victims that were present. And again, he did not look over at them or address them in any way.
Can you tell us more about his last day?
Charles spent most of today, let me start that over. Charles, over the last several days, has had extended visits with family and friends. This morning he would have had extended visits, and then he would have been taken midday from the Polinsky unit, death row, to the Walls unit here. And that's where he spent all of the afternoon.
His last meal?
Last meal that was served to Charles, which was served to everyone else here, was baked chicken, mashed potatoes, carrots, and green beans.
Phil Archer, journalist at a local TV station, also witnessed the execution. It's the first time Phil Archer saw a man die.
I can tell you what happened. We were let in. There are two viewing rooms. The witnesses for the victims from their family were in the viewing room across from us. We couldn't actually see them. We were in a viewing room with guards. Mr. Charles had no one, family or friends, there for him. So we were let in there. I think we got in there about 6:05. At 6:11, he made the only statement he made. He was asked, there was a warden and a chaplain in the room with him, and he was asked if he had any last statement to make, and he said, "No, I'm ready to go home." He had his eyes closed as he said that. He opened his eyes briefly and looked at the ceiling, and then closed them again. He seemed to go to sleep about, well, shortly after that. It didn't take him long after he made that statement that he seemed to relax. And then finally, he was pronounced dead at 6:36. And that is that. That's all, pretty much all that happened. Or is it the total of what happened? Well, I shouldn't say all that happened.
How is it to witness this?
Well, it's sobering. It's not something I think anyone would choose to do. I'm doing it because it's part of my job. But there's nothing to be recommended about watching someone die.
Not far from the Wolves Unit, you can find the largest prison cemetery in the U.S. with 3,000 graves. The bodies that are not claimed by the families are buried here by fellow inmates.
We met a man who saw death in the eyes, here, at San Quentin State Prison, north of San Francisco. It's Sunday morning. We're lining up with visiting families. The rules are very strict. No cell phones, no objects. We just allowed a little money to buy the inmate a snack. I turned out to have a $50 bill in my pocket. The guard tells me, oh, there's no coins, only coins allowed. But there's a changing machine right there behind you. Now imagine changing $50 into quarters. It makes the same sound than when you win the jackpot in Las Vegas, except in Vegas you don't look stupid. This is the visiting room. We look around, trying to find the guy we are here to meet. He's actually right behind us. Kevin Cooper is in a cage. So they handcuff him. They let us in. The door is shut, and the handcuffs are taken off. Now you understand why they call it a contact visit. Cooper says, the state of California tried to kill me. On December 17, 2003, he got his date of execution. From that day, he was put on death watch, a special cell with 24/7 video monitoring. They take his last photo, his last measurements. At 6 p.m., the execution team arrives. They strip search him. Kevin Cooper says, the place is so cold, it feels like a morgue. He refuses the last meal, doesn't want food from those who are going to kill him. Four hours before the execution at 8:15 p.m., the phone rings. The United States Supreme Court has decided to stay Kevin Cooper's execution. Doesn't happen very often. He says, I felt life enter my body again. Later in the prison, Kevin Cooper saw some of these men again, the men who had volunteered for his execution.
This painting is by Kevin Cooper. It's a message to his lawyer. It's called Free Me. This one, he called it, it's a generational thing. when we visited him, Kevin explained, in the prison you can find a dad, a son, and a grandson all locked up at the same time. The little guy in the front, he's wondering, is this what's in store for me? At the beginning of this project, we were told on death row you'll meet African Americans, Latinos, whites, but never a rich person. That was true. Those who can afford a good lawyer escape the death sentence. And it's not only the size of your wallet that counts. Race also plays a crucial role. This piece is by Kenneth Reams on Arkansas death row. It's called The Last Mile. Reams pictured that last corridor leading to the execution chamber. Inmates call it the last mile. What happens once you take those very last steps? Listen to James Willett, former director of Huntsville Prison. During his time there, Willett oversaw 83 executions.
The officer opened the door, I would tell the inmate, follow me. I'd turn my back to him. I'd come into the chamber. And when he got in, I would tell him to get up on the gurney and lie down, of course, with his head at that end. And the officers, there would be about 5 of them, and they've done this a bunch of times, so they very quickly get those straps on the inmate. I would dismiss them back to the cell block. And then I would walk over to that door and open it, and there would be 2 medical people in there. They would come out and start an IV in each arm. One of them is live, and the other one is for backup. Then they would go back in the room. That leaves the chaplain and I in there with the inmate. The staff would bring the 2 groups of witnesses. The inmate's witnesses would be with one staff member. Get them in, then you bring in the victim's witnesses and put them in the other room. Once that was done, I would tell the inmate he could make his last statement. Most of them made a last statement. Most of them were short. Once they were through, I would give a signal to the executioner that he could start doing what he had to do. In about 30 seconds, that inmate would take his last breath. And maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes from then, the executioner would give me a signal telling me that he had all the fluids in the body. Just as a precautionary, I would wait 3 more minutes, and then I would open the door to the cell block again. And there was a doctor waiting in there. He would come out and do all those things that doctors do to pronounce someone dead. A flashlight in the eye, checking for a pulse, stethoscope to the heart, that kind of thing. And then he would give a time of death, and he'd go back into the cell block. At that point, the staff takes the witnesses out 1 group at a time, and when they're out, the Huntsville Funeral Home would come and take the body to the funeral home.
So you were the one giving the signal for the execution to start?
Yes.
Did you feel guilty? Did you feel like you were killing someone?
I never felt guilty about it. It's a hard process, it was for me to watch, but I always figured myself as being, if you will, a cog in a wheel. I mean, there's a lot of things happen before this guy winds up here on this gurney. In fact, I've thought before how hard it would be to be someone who was on a jury for this person, who had said, we find this guy guilty and I'm voting for his death. How hard it must be for them on that night,
Just a cog in a wheel.
Now listen to the story of Kenneth Reams, the man who drew this. Kenneth grew up on these streets in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a city also called Crime Bluff. He had just turned 18 when he drove along this road with his friend Alfred. Alfred was about to graduate from high school and he needed $40 to pay his cap and gown. The 2 men decided to rob an ATM machine, this ATM machine. Alfred panicked and shot the victim. An innocent man died that day. The teens had 1 gun, 1 shot was fired, but the prosecutor made the same offer to both. Plead guilty and you'll get life without parole. If not, I'll request the death penalty. Alford, who had pulled the trigger, took the deal. Kenneth did not. Today, Kenneth says, how could I plead guilty to something I didn't do? I trusted the justice system. Kenneth Reams was sentenced to death. Today, he's still fighting to get a new trial. His lawyer, George Kendall, is here with us tonight, and he'll tell you more about it later.
Sisterhood is the title of this painting made by Ndume Olatushani. While he was sitting on death row in Tennessee, he became a great painter. To escape the walls, he painted the world he was dreaming of, the people he wanted to meet. Ndume says, thanks to art, I never felt like I was their prisoner. Freedom is a state of mind.
In 1985, Ndume was sentenced to death for a murder he had not committed. He spent 28 years, almost more than half his life, behind bars for a crime he had not committed. And that crime happened in Memphis, a city where he had never been to. It took Ndume and his lawyers 20 years of legal fighting and lots of help to walk out free. If he had been detained in a state like Texas, Ndume could be a dead man today. Luckily enough, Ndume Olatushani is with us tonight. Please welcome him.
Ndume, you say that art saved your life?
Yeah, art did save my life.
Tell us how.
Yeah, art did save my life. But for that, I wouldn't be here. I think that, every time I have a chance to just kind of see this and just kind of be a part of it, I'm always reminded of how fortunate I am, that I was able to find art in the space that I actually did, because it was through my art that people were able to be drawn a little closer, and because of that kind of proximity with my art, they was able to learn about my situation. And so, yeah, not only did art save my life and that allowed for me to find freedom in a 4x9-foot cell, it also, too, like I said, literally, but for the lawyers here, and I want to say this here, because I think that, I didn't had, a lot of opportunities to share my story with people, but tonight I have the privilege of actually being here with 3 of the lawyers that worked on my case, and I certainly want to have them at some point. I don't want to take a whole lot of time, because if you want to learn about my story, you can certainly go on the internet. I mean, I could tell you what art did for me, and how important it is that an institution like this and other individuals, institutions, organizations support the work that not only they doing, but find a way to support people sitting in that situation, because but for art, I wouldn't be standing here. But like I said, the thing for me is, it's really important to have these guys here with me tonight, because but for them, I'm telling you, but for the lawyers at Cleary, David, both of the Davids and Jonathan Blackman here, that I wouldn't be standing here, and I ain't no illusion about that. No illusion about how fortunate I am to actually be here. So art saved my life.
Could you tell us what it was like a normal day on death row, what it was like for you? What did you do in this small cell?
I think, I was one of the people that, first off, I knew that I shouldn't have been there in the first place. And I never internalized the belief that I actually would be executed for something that I didn't do. And I always believed that one day I would actually be free. And so for me, I always tried not to have a typical day at death row. I mean, prison is a mundane place. I mean, you got routine. I mean, I could actually tell you the day of the week based on the food that we was actually eating, that you could tell the day of the week. That's how routine prison was. So for me, I would always try to break up the space, the little space that I was actually in, by trying to create just something different where I wasn't having a typical day on death row. But I spent a lot of time, I chose not to. I know in Texas, people ain't even allowed to have TVs. And I mean, if you ever been in a situation, you ain't got to do nothing but maybe go in your bathroom, because most bathrooms that people go in every day is bigger than some of the prison cells that people are actually sitting in. But you can just go in there and get some idea of what it might be like to spend years upon years sitting in a space like that, especially without TV. For the first 10 years of my imprisonment, I chose not to have a TV because I didn't want to get lost in that little space, spending hours watching TV and get nothing done. So I read a lot of books. I was one of them people, like I said, I always knew that one day I would be free. I chose to get a GED while I was sitting on death row. So I didn't go to death row waiting to die. I actually went to death row and I was full of life. I was full of life, so I was living.
Most inmates don't are broken by the system. How was it? Did you witness this when you were there?
I did. I mean, I tell people, I mean, you can go to any prison, and when you go there, you come up to it, but for defenses, you could say that it looked like a college campus. But the reality is that it belies the truth about the mental and psychological deprivations that people are dealing with every day, especially on death row. So yeah, I seen people came in just the same as I was, and in a matter of a few years, broken by the process, and ended up on psychotropic drugs and all type of medication, forcibly being medicated, just so when the time comes that they can tell the court that this person was competent. So you have people being forcibly medicated. So yeah, certainly death row and prison generally. I mean, people sit back and you hear and see this stuff on TV about what prison is, but prison is a hard life, and death row certainly is it's even harder because you're living with this idea that you literally walking in the shadow of death.
And you imposed a discipline on yourself. You gave up on having a TV. What is it? You were able to get only one meal a day.
Yeah, for me, I mean,
you taught yourself to.
Yeah, that was one of the things that for a lot of years when I was in prison, I chose because in prison, everything is used as a control mechanism. TVs, food. Being able to get outside and wreck yours, all this stuff is used as a control mechanism. So for me, I was one of the people, I never wanted to lift weights, or I was saying earlier that I used to exercise in my cell because, and I call them calisthenics, they're calisthenics. I would do all my exercise in my cell, and I did that based on, I conditioned my body that I would, just if I was able to get a really good breakfast, then I was able to, go through the day. And that's how I chose to do it because I never wanted to be in a position where oftentimes when stuff go on in prison, the people come, they lock the prison down, the officers then have to do the work. They're bringing food in, and so they do everything that they can to just kind of mess with you. You on a sack lunch, you eating 2 sack lunches a day. So for me, I knew that as long as I wasn't dependent on that, then I never could be just kind of broken and bent by this process.
And last question before we want to bring more people to the stage. So 28 years behind bar, the whole world has changed.
It did. It did.
So what was the most difficult part of it?
Change for I was one of them people, like I said, I was always trying to prepare for freedom. But the thing that is most hard for me, and it's still kind of hard for me, is this whole technological leap that happened while I was away for nearly 3 decades. So
come on, you have the latest iPhone.
Yeah. And I got an 8-year-old daughter. She know more about it than I do. Yeah. But yeah, that's technology. That was the thing for me, because when you're sitting in prison, during the time that I was sitting in prison, and I think that one of the things that people should understand about prison, especially, aside from the death penalty, prison is a huge industry. And so hundreds of billions of dollars is involved in locking people up. And in this country, that simply means somebody going to jail. And so when you go in prison, you were saying, there's nothing inside the prison trying to prepare people to come out and be productive people in society. And so because you need them to keep recidivating back into the system. And so during the time that I was actually in prison, they actually took typewriters out of the prison. And you know how antiquated that technology is, but they took typewriters out of the prison from those of us who were sitting there. But there was no value, no penological value at all to taking typewriters from people, except that what it does, that when you have society moving toward everything did on the computer, you can't, why would you take typewriters, the very thing that somebody might be able to learn a typing skill so they could be able to navigate a computer? They took that out of there. Prison is, like I said, you hear this stuff, but prison is actually a hard life. I mean, there's no joke sitting in prison.
Now, you were talking about your lawyers.
Yeah.
It took 20 years, 25 lawyers, 17,000 pro bono hours to get you out. And I'm not talking about your wife.
Yeah, and listen.
So perhaps we would like David and the lawyers involved to come up.
Yeah, please.
Stage.
We're going to the panel.
I want to say one quick thing in terms of, like I said, but for these guys, I'm telling you, I wouldn't be standing here. Like she said, my wife, I met my wife through my art, and it was through my wife that clearly got involved in my case. And like I said, ain't no question in my mind, but for the work that these guys did and dedicating their life to me to save my life, I wouldn't be here. I'm saying, and it's such a privilege for me to actually be up here with you guys in this particular space where people are trained to come out and do the very thing that you guys are doing. So I hope if you got law students in here, if somebody tell you that they're innocent of a crime, don't just write them off. Don't just write them off, because you could save their life like they did mine.
I just wanted to ask one last question, because the one thing that Ndume didn't say about his life and his case, Ndume has not been exonerated. He took an Alford plea, which means that he got no financial compensation. The people who did that mistake, who led him to be in jail for so long, never were accountable of that. So I was wondering, perhaps you want to address this?
I just want to say one thing. When she said it was a mistake, in my case, it wasn't a mistake, but they can certainly tell you about the Alford plea.
Well, it was not a mistake on the prosecution's part. I think they knew what they were doing. They concealed evidence that would have vindicated Ndume. They coerced witnesses to give testimony to support what they were trying to prove. They made deals with a witness and then lied about it. When it came to trial, this was a trial of an African-American man accused of killing a white man. They used what's called peremptory strikes to get rid of every single potential African-American juror, all 6 of their strikes, to get an all-white jury to try a black man accused of killing a white man. So this was not a mistake. These guys were not playing fair. They were not seeking justice. The Alford plea came, it was after 17 years, Ndume was 53 years old, we managed to get his conviction overturned. At that point, the state could have sought the death penalty again. We'd actually gotten the death penalty overturned years earlier, but they could have sought it again. Knowing the Memphis prosecutor's office, which New York Times just profiled in an article in August, is up to the same nonsense, the same concealing of evidence. Knowing them, they very well may have sought the death penalty again. That would have meant Ndume couldn't have been released on bail pending another trial. Knowing the delays that we dealt with in our case, again, took 17 years because of the long lags. A motion would be made to a court. a year would pass before the court would even rule on the motion. Then that would have to be appealed. 2 years would pass before we'd get a ruling on the appeal. So the process of getting to a trial to show his innocence, to prove it to a jury, could have gone on for years. All the while, Ndume would have been in prison. So it was time to get Ndume out. It was time to put all of that behind him. And I think I'll let Ndume speak as to whether that was the right decision to make. But I think it clearly, from our perspective, it clearly was.
Yeah, the thing that, the people offered me a 25-year sentence in the middle of my trial when I was going to trial, and I refused it then, and all the way up until I had to counsel these guys and my family coming and telling me that it was probably in my best interest to actually go and do this here because it would allow for me to walk out sooner rather than later. I chose to actually enter into this Alfred plea because I was actually prepared to just, it had already took 28 years from me, so I was actually prepared to just sit it out and just go through this process. But when I think back now, I'm so glad that I had good counsel and people that I trusted to come and help me make this decision because the last 5 years since I've been home, this past June 1st has been 5 years since I've been home, and it's been such an amazing 5 years. I've had so many opportunities. Look at me, I'm here. I'm saying I'm here.
I just want to capture one thing very briefly. I think, Patrick, you asked about the passage of time and the advent of technology. So on the day of Ndume's release, he was able to go move in with his now wife, Anne-Marie Moyes, who supported Ndume over the years, became interested in his case. That inspired her to go to law school at Vanderbilt, graduated first in her class, became a public defender, and lived in a lovely bungalow house in East Nashville. So Ndume was incredibly fortunate not only to have been released, but to have this lovely life to move into. And one of the great kind of poignant moments and joys of Ndume's release, he was released in the morning after several days of waiting for the paperwork, and came out to huge hugs from Anne-Marie and me and all of the other supporters, and I flew home to New York. But one of the great joys of his release was the next morning getting an email from my client. And if you've ever represented someone on death row, you don't get emails from your clients on death row. And I don't know if you remember it, but it was, David, wow, I'm just sitting here looking at Anne-Marie. She was asleep. It was 6 a.m, looking at the cat. The cat is sitting in your lap. You're out. You're living your life. So I think that moment and that freedom, I think, made it all worthwhile.
It did.
Thank you. We leave it to you.
Thank you. Going to stay on stage. We'll be moving down.
Jag install some stool.
Bring a couple more lawyers into the conversation. That we heard from David Herrington, who was doing one of his counsel. George Kendall is director of the Squire Sanders Public Service Initiative Pro Bono Working Group. Focuses most of its energy on pro bono litigation and policy methods. Carine Williams is an associate at Sullivan and Cromwell, formerly at Squire Sanders also. Her practice has focused on complex federal appeals, death penalty, and habeas corpus litigation. And after we talk for a while, we'll open up the floor to questions. So if you have something on your mind, hold it briefly. I'm going to ask George the question that I asked him before and got an equivocal answer on, which is, will we have a death penalty in 20 years? And if not, how do we get there?
The death penalty is in our DNA in this country, unfortunately. While the rest of the world that we have the greatest adherence with and and common ground with have abandoned the death penalty, and proudly so. It remains here. There are very positive signs that in many parts of the country we are turning a very important page. In 1999, there were 20 years ago, there were 300 people death sentenced every year in this country. Last year, there were 32 or 33. That's an extraordinary drop. And as Bill said in his opening remark, the death penalty now is not how many states have the death penalty. There's still about 30 states that have the death penalty. It's really how many counties in America use the death penalty. And it's less than 30 that use the death penalty. Texas has this reputation of being really tough on crime, and in a lot of ways it is. Most prosecutors in Texas today have never used the death penalty and will never use it in the future. This is a damaged brand. There have been a lot of innocent people convicted, but more importantly, the death penalty took a valuable right from every person in America, and that was habeas corpus. You have one of the great habeas corpus scholars in this law school, Jim Liebman. It is really what enforces the Bill of Rights. When you didn't get fairness, as our friend here tonight did not get in the state courts, oftentimes you have to go to the federal court where judges have life tenure. And it's been badly damaged because of this. Congress decided 20 years ago we couldn't have both habeas corpus and the death penalty. It had to make a choice, and unfortunately it chose we need to execute people as opposed to have healthy habeas corpus. So, Bill, I think that we're moving in the right direction, but we live also in a country that continues to surprise. So there's Jim Liebman there. Hi, Jim. A terrific scholar and lawyer, and done extraordinary important work on the death penalty for 30 years. So hopefully we're going to get there, but we're not there yet.
A reporter for Swiss Radio asked me beforehand, and I'm going to pass the question along to the panel. Is there something in the American character that makes us so wedded to the death penalty? I mean, we are the only Western country, except for Belarus, which is not necessarily a company you want to keep, that still executes people. Is this shame on us?
It's absolutely shame on us, but I think it has something to do with our reluctance to really wrestle with the truth of our history, how this country started, the violence that was involved in it. And I think one of the things that was struck when we were talking earlier about the conditions of death row is just how many sort of like death by 1,000 nicks before you even get to the execution chamber, in terms of how many different functions there are on the road to dehumanize people, to control them, to subject them to force at every turn. And that's what allows us to keep making this decision. When you ask, well, will it continue? That's really up to us as a collective to continue with this form of punishment, is that we don't see the people who are on death row as fully human.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I think that the death penalty in this country certainly has a long history, and I think that people in this country do have this kind of insatiable appetite, not only for the death penalty but for violence. I think that when you look at the movies, I mean, most of the biggest box office movies in this country, I mean, they are the most violent. And so it is this kind of, like you said, this root. When you think about, like you said, how this country was founded, that every violent act that you can think about was, this country was founded on. And I think it's some truth to, the fruit don't fall far from the tree.
Anybody else want to add to that? No, okay. At the Marshall Project, we regularly publish writing by people who are inside the system. That can be judges or corrections officers or whatever, but most of the time it's inmates. And we got an interesting commentary last year when California was debating whether to either abolish the death penalty or accelerate the death penalty. And this is a death row inmate in California who said, who was advocating that that the abolition of the death penalty legislation not be passed, because life without parole, which is the alternative prescribed in that legislation and the most common alternative everywhere, is even worse. Or it's death by a different name, slower and more agonizing. I'm interested in hearing you react to that.
We all have clients who are on death row who share that feeling all over the country. Kenny Reams, whose art is on the wall here and who is really a marvelous artist. He came very close to saying, I can't take this anymore. At 18, he was death sentenced and put on death row, 23 hours a day. He's been there for more than 20 years. Kenny had one of the roughest upbringings of any case I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of horrible upbringings. And he was losing it. What's the point of all this? He has friends who are doing life without parole in that state, and it's a horrific existence. And sort of apropos of what this evening is really about, what saved him was a former death row inmate came and talked to him and said, no, Kenny, I understand that you have some real art talent. Why aren't you using it? And to make a long story short, that afternoon and a next morning visit from that former death row inmate ignited a spark in that very depressed, lost guy. And in the next 2 years, using the crudest hobby crafts, he produced 80 pieces of art. He inspired half the row to begin to write poetry or just do something to deal with this. And the movies, live outside of the cell. Don't let that cell crush you. And so, Bill, I think that if we allow prisoners to have something to do, then you can have a better chance of doing your time. But unfortunately, we've lived in a moment of history where people in solitary confinement have nothing to do in many places, and people with life without parole sentences oftentimes are in that kind of terrible shape. It doesn't need to be that way, but that's the way it's been.
How do you guys feel about life without parole?
Well, I think that I certainly lived around people that said that, and some of them still say that because I'm still in touch with some of my friends that's still on death row. But the thing that I would say to them is that, life has purpose. I mean, you can find purpose, or purpose finds us. I mean, when we a lot of people go through life looking for these grand purposes to do, but the reality is that, purpose finds us, and the only thing we have to do is step up to the plate when it actually happens. And I think that, like I said, I got people, I consider family that's still sitting there, and I try to tell them that even if you're sitting in prison, where you talking about the people was talking about I was supposed to be executed. I'm saying as long as we're alive, we got hope. And that's the thing that I would say to people, even if you're sitting in prison for life, and I'm telling you what I said, prison is a hard life, but I still think that, that just because you're sitting in prison don't necessarily mean that you can't have life, but also, too, make a difference in other people's lives. That's what I would say to them.
I mean, I was struck by some of the words from our diplomat from Switzerland about why the Swiss are so adamantly against the death penalty, and one of the things that she mentioned was error. And I remember the words of Brian Stevenson in one of his TED Talks talking about the error rate of capital punishment being 1 in 10. So from the lawyer's perspective, putting my lawyer's hat on, and recalling just how frustrating, these cases take so long. And, when you come into a case, maybe as a young lawyer, it's already been going on 10 years, 20 years, 30 years even. It really requires being reminded that as long as your client's alive, there's another way, there's some other way there's some other way, thing that you can try, some way to twist the Rubik's Cube to try to get him out or her out. So, that is another important distinction between life without parole and the death penalty. If we've made a mistake on a life without parole sentence, there's still some chance that we can fix the error.
Let me just say one thing in the spirit of this evening. For those of you who work with somebody in that situation, whether you're a pen pal, whether you're a lawyer, what we try to do now is, unless our client is really damaged, is to challenge them. Okay, you're off death row now. Do something with your life. And just really quickly, a client in Florida, 30 years on death row, 23 hours a day lockup. He gets out, he's in his 50s. He's now out of prison. And do something. He went and got his GED, and it was hard for him to get that GED. Fast forward 2 years, guess who is the best tutor in that institution to help other people get their GEDs? He is, and guess what? He's at an institution that's like, he says, we're Florida State. There are 2 other prisons in Florida that are Harvard and Columbia. He says, they have a better pass rate on GED, but guess what? Next year, we're going to beat them. He's got purpose. These folks, if you help them find purpose, not only does it help them, but it can change in little ways and big ways the institution.
I would just pause on life without parole. I think what everybody is saying about the death penalty is hugely different and hugely worse than anything else, of course. But I do think life without parole probably doesn't get the level of scrutiny and concern that it merits, because it is in comparison to the death penalty. So it's a sort of escape valve that doesn't seem as intense. It's not as intense, but it's a pretty horrible sentence to impose on someone, saying you will die in prison. There's no doubt about it. You will die in prison. So I think we have to deal with the death penalty first, but then I think we need to turn our sights on life without parole.
The 3 lawyers on this panel have visited a number of death rows around the country and a number of prisons. I'm curious how you would appraise the availability of things like cultural programs and educational programs for people on death row.
Yeah, I mean, it can be very, very stark. I was struck by some of the images and the comments from inmates that were at the Polensky unit in Texas, and recall a client that George and I had also at the Polensky unit, where there's no TV, where it's really truly the most sterile environment that I've ever been in. I recall my first visit there, taking my coins to go get food from the vending machine for the client, and reaching to pick up the plastic wrapped food and being rushed by several guards because I couldn't even touch the plastic that was around the food. They had to reach into the vending machine with like tongs and hand that to the inmate because he couldn't even have something that a person had touched so proximate to him. And I recall this particular client telling me about how, his cell was so spare and bare, but what he would do is just order a bunch of books from the library and stack them up on his desk. So there was the cartoon image of the cell. You saw the little thin strip of a window that goes at the top of the cell. So he would stack them up in his cell, and where there's no TV, where there's no other insight into any world other than that cell, he would stand on those books for as long as he physically could to watch what was going on outside his cell.
You've really got to take initiative to fight for books, fight for resources if you're on death row. Prisoners will be perfectly happy for you to just be in that cell and drive yourself crazy, really, by just watching TV all the time if you have access to TV or listening to your radio. You really have to be an advocate for yourself to get the hobby craft material, to really try to build a life. It's not easy. And, as Bill said earlier, most people who are death sentenced, they're not going to be executed. There should be some investment in these folks, but in most places, at least where I've been, it's very difficult to really be able to have access to regular stuff and to build a life.
I think we'll open up the floor to questions from our audience. You're supposed to use a mic because we're being broadcast. How does somebody get a mic, Ellen? Okay, oh, you've got mics. Okay, good. Just please push the button until you get the green light and then speak into the microphone. Yes.
This is not so much a question as a comment. I represent Kevin Cooper along with a number of other lawyers. And I just wanted to add to the comment that I think Anne made about Kevin having declined his final meal, and that is we advised him when they asked him whether he wanted a minister or a chaplain or the like to speak to before he was going to be taken to the execution, or they're going to kill him. And we advised him to decline that because the experience often is that that chaplain or whoever who's a prison chaplain will come back and say, well, he confessed or she confessed right before, I left. And just to bring that to people's attention. One other thing about Kevin, who I see every week or every other week, in addition to being a superb artist, as are many of these people, he is a superb writer. And I think also mentioned the period from December 17th to February 9th, 3 hours and 40 minutes before he was to be killed. And he's written about that, and those essays are on the website that we have for savekevincooper.org. If you want to read something that is that shows you how barbaric this whole process is, this whole system is, I recommend that as well as other things. I want to do one shout out, and that's to you, Bill, and to the Marshall Project. You people were marvelous in helping us get, and I don't know if it's the only time people said it was, the American Bar Association's president and the American Bar Association to write a letter to Jerry Brown, our governor, in support of our petition for clemency. And that has had some real impact. So I want to just to thank you publicly and for the work that the Marshall Project does. It's a very important work.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes, back there.
Hi, my question is for Ndume. If you can, I'd like to hear about how you started getting into painting. The images that, I didn't have the chance to look at the images outside yet, but the images that were projected are just striking in technique and content and style. And so I wanted to know if you had been painting before going to prison, or if you learned in prison, and how that came about, because I don't imagine there are art teachers there.
No, you're correct. It wasn't any art teachers there, and I am a self-taught artist. I tell people now that I was an artist before I found myself sitting on death row. But before I got there, I really didn't have no interest in art. The thing that happened for me a couple of years into my imprisonment, or even before that, it was a guy on death row. He was later executed himself, but he was an artist, and I commissioned him to do this portrait of me, and because I wanted to send it to my mom. Long story short, he did it, didn't look nothing like me, and so the whole time I'm sitting in this cell, I'm looking at it thinking, man, I could have did a better job and kept my money, and which I think it was like 6 or 7 cartons of cigarettes at the time. But the thing that happened for me a couple of years into my imprisonment, my mother was actually killed in a car accident, and the worst thing that can happen to somebody sitting in prison is the people come to your cell and tell you that, hey, listen, we need to take you to make a phone call home, because you're not getting free phone calls, and when they come and tell you that somebody done died. And so when the people came to my cell and told me they need to take me down, shackle and chain me to take me down to make this phone call, the whole time I'm thinking, what my mother gonna tell me once I got down there. But it was actually my sister on the phone telling me what happened to my mother, and you know, when I got there, I mean, you see this stuff on TV, and it really was happening for me. It's like when you see TVs, you know, something going on, everything just kind of slow down, you can't process it. So when my sister telling me this, it's like everything just slowed down. I couldn't really process what she was actually telling me. I mean, within a few seconds, I mean, it, you know, I was hearing what she was actually saying, but, you know, when that happened, I was already sitting on death row, so I'm already sitting where I'm sitting. And when this thing happened to my mom, I'm telling you, I'm flat on the ground. I can't, for the first 3 days, when I got that information, if my eyes was open, I was crying. If I wasn't crying, I was balled up in a tear-soaked sleep. And on the third day, I'm laying down in this tear-soaked sleep. And as clear as we sitting here, my mother came to me, and the only thing she said was, "Get up." And when it happened, I jumped straight up because I'm thinking this nightmare is actually over that I was experiencing. But I woke up to the reality. It was what it was. And but it was as I was picking myself up or trying to pick myself back up from that, art found me. You know, like I said, I'm sitting in this small space, and the things that one of the last things my mother said to me the last time I actually seen her, physically seen her, when she was going out of the visiting room, I just kind of jokingly said, "Oh, girl, I wouldn't know what to do if I ain't have you in my life," and it was true. I mean, my mother was with me when the world was against me, and I knew that. And but she just jokingly said, "Oh, yeah, you're gonna know what to do when the time comes." And you know, when she said that, I mean, neither one of us actually knew that that would actually be the last time we physically see each other. But it was those words that kept ringing in my ear, and what she told me to get up. And also, too, I was reflecting back on when I was looking at this portrait that she'd never seen, that I could have did a better job. And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, only thing was stopping me from actually doing it was not doing it myself. And so that's how I started drawing, and eventually I started painting. But yeah, I taught myself how to paint while I was sitting there on death row.
Anybody else have a question? Okay. There is a reception upstairs afterwards, if anybody wants to come mingle. Third floor. Okay. And Ndume will have some of his artwork for sale if you're interested. I'll leave you with a small gift. Ear Hustle. If any of you listen to podcasts, go subscribe to Ear Hustle. It's put out by inmates at San Quentin, and it's the best podcast you'll listen to all week, I promise.
Just one I'm the last thing standing between you and the cocktail reception, but just very last word. So this project started in Los Angeles in 2015. It opened at the Annenberg School of Journalism, so the journalist of tomorrow. Then it went through Ohio, Texas, went through Switzerland and Norway. And now we're so proud and happy to be here at Columbia Law School with the lawyers of tomorrow. And we just want to give very special thanks to Ellen Chapnick and Jeffrey Fagan, who made this possible here. Thank you so much.